Somebody knows the full story. Somebody knows the truth. And that somebody, or those somebodies, are the only ones who can explain exactly what happened to Daniel Reed, DJ Smith, in the hours before his lifeless body was left on the railroad tracks in a remote region of Dorchester County, South Carolina on August 11, 2018. As our news team visited this site last week, one thing became immediately and abundantly clear. This was not some random location. This was not an easy or inviting spot. Driving to the location would be impossible in most vehicles. Walking it was difficult even for a healthy person approaching the area during daylight hours. The very purpose of the grade of the elevation and the roughness of the stone that complicates the passage to the railroad track is to discourage wanderers. It was not someplace to be found or someplace anyone would even know existed. Few people would have reason to even know of it. This is the kind of place that has to be deliberately sought out, as it is not subject to accidental discovery. Visiting the site where DJ's body was found, a stretch of railroad just southeast of Ridgeville, South Carolina, not only reinforced our suspicions about this case, it provided a perspective that could not have been achieved any other way. Whoever left DJ here planned to do so, even if that plan was hatched in the moments immediately following his death. Two things were necessary: assistance from people who would be willing and able to move a body, and the kind of rugged transportation that could get them there. The new moon would have provided no illumination on that darkest of nights, and those involved did not choose an easy path. So, if you think of DJ as having been discarded like trash, that description fails to adequately express just how very difficult this was to accomplish. So why choose this place? Why choose these tracks for this murder? If the intent was to conceal a crime, the train schedule would have meant discovery was inevitable. If the intent was to destroy evidence, this would be an epic fail. However, if the intent was to confuse the situation, that much was accomplished. During this episode, we will revisit a set of interviews conducted by agents of the South Carolina State Law Enforcement Division with some key players. Interviews which were conducted nearly 6 months after the crime. If you haven't listened to the first parts of this story yet, now would be a good time to go back and listen so you can experience this investigation in order. Getting up to speed is important because while nothing about this case adds up, and while none of the witness accounts seem to match up with the facts as we know them, we are taking you today to one indisputable point of geographic fact: the precise coordinates on the railroad tracks in wooded, swampy Dorchester County where DJ's body was discovered. There, the facts will guide our story, continuing our exploration into yet-to-be-revealed truths about those who went to such great lengths to abandon DJ in this place after his murder. As we take this journey together, remember this: there are people with information about this crime. There are individuals who are not responsible for DJ's death who have specific knowledge of the series of events that include his murder and leaving him on the tracks. Somebody needs to speak up. Given the nature of this investigation, it could be that someone tried but didn't get through, or that their efforts were ignored or refused. If so, it's time to try again.
Welcome back to FITSFiles, your new home for true crime and corruption, wherever you download podcasts. I'm your host, founding editor Will Folks of FITSNews.com. Previously on FITSFiles, our team introduced you to a new investigation, Death on the Tracks, the story of Daniel Reed, DJ Smith of Dorchester County, South Carolina. After receiving an independent review of DJ's autopsy and his cause of death, our news team, joined by attorney Tucker Player, traveled to Dorchester County to view the location along the tracks where DJ's body was found. Viewing this location in person was a critical next step for our team as they continue to tell this story and describe in detail the battle that lies ahead for DJ's family as they continue to seek accountability for the death of their son. Once again, as DJ's family pushes for answers, fights for justice, and strives for real accountability, our team is taking this journey with them and with you, searching for the same things ourselves, searching for truth. Once again, our producer and lead investigator, Jen Wood.
No one should have to investigate the death of a loved one, or worse yet, their child who died under suspicious circumstances. In this case, there was no other way to bring the truth to light. An investigation that was twice botched by law enforcement left the family and the community lacking answers and justice. If the claims of suicide, meth psychosis, or falling asleep on the tracks seemed a reach initially, visiting the site put those theories to rest once and for all. The fact that these claims were made by investigators who had visited the scene is nothing if not confounding. Yet, it is to the SLED investigation we return, to consider law enforcement's interviews with some of the most promising suspects. These interviews were not ideal, occurring as they did many months later. In January of 2019, an incident provoked one of the people who attended the party with DJ to contact investigators. It went down something like this. Steve Creel and Heather Doyle got into an argument of some sort in Ridgeville. The cousins were both at the party with DJ on his last night, and Heather later said it was the first time she met DJ. The conflict became so aggressive that law enforcement was called to break it up. There was a warrant out for Heather in Colleton County, so she was taken into custody. While she was in the county jail, she decided to contact investigators about DJ's death. You will likely recall that from August to December, there was no significant progress made in the investigation that originated with the Dorchester County Sheriff's Office and ended up in the hands of SLED. Half of the people who were at the party where DJ was last seen alive were not interviewed. There were no suspects, no plausible theories, and as the coroner's report was finally signed, it was the opposite of progress. After leaving the report open for months in anticipation of evidence that would support the conclusion that DJ was killed and then left on the tracks, the coroner conceded to the results of the autopsy in which the medical examiner referred to the incident as, quote, best described as accidental, end quote. So, when an altercation between Steve Creel and Heather Doyle resulted in her temporary relocation to the Colleton County Jail, it presented an opportunity for investigators. They met with Heather via video conference on January 14th. It was the first time she had been interviewed. Previous accounts of that night's events involved Heather so affected by ecstasy that she was hiding from blue lights she believed to be drones. The accounts of others described a variety of actions to Heather that ranged from being completely uninvolved in the situation to being an active participant in the argument between Ashley and DJ. The argument that the partygoers claimed to be the reason DJ went out into the dark of night, walking towards Ridgeville and carrying his belongings. In another telling, Heather returned at some point and borrowed a blanket from Ashley and her roommate Catherine, and it was never seen again. There is no indication from the SLED report on the investigation that this new contact initiated by Heather provided a new sense of direction or new leads for the stalled effort, and yet there were no new interviews conducted in the days that followed. What Heather had to say was not necessarily new information, not for anyone paying attention to the family and the talk in the community. The statements she provided implicated her cousin, Steve Creel, which came as no surprise. She also pointed at Matthew Creel, another cousin, as an accomplice. However, it was Heather's comments regarding another suspect that are of much interest despite the fact that these comments were quickly dismissed by those who interviewed her.
Heather said she was present at the home of Steve Creel when he shot Michael Muckenfuss, aka Arana, days after DJ's death. She told investigators Steve shot Michael as a warning not to talk to authorities about what had transpired that night. While a corresponding incident report makes no note of Heather's presence and calls the shooting a suicide attempt, Michael later says he was shot 5 times. The very words are entirely inconsistent with a suicide attempt. To be clear, when Michael is asked by members of law enforcement, he calls the shooting a failed suicide attempt. However, that is not the way he describes the event to friends or on his Facebook page. Michael lost an eye and suffered other injuries. He was hospitalized for 2 weeks. If he was not part of the murder or an accessory to putting DJ's body on the tracks, something happened to Michael Muckenfuss, aka Arana, as evidenced by a pattern of escalating behavior. In that respect, Michael's behavior, and the behavior of one other person of interest, seems to betray something more that was going on with these individuals at the time. Michael had been acting erratically since DJ's death. Many claim he was with Steve Creel and Dalton Riley when the unthinkable happened, and after, when DJ's body was transported to the tracks several miles away. When Michael was shot, he lost an eye, and then he found Jesus. Even so, days later he was arrested in Colleton County for domestic violence. Days after that, he's arrested again for driving under suspension. But it doesn't end for him there. He continues to be arrested for one infraction after another. He begins attending church, and some think he's turning his life around. But whatever happened to Michael on the evening of DJ's death, or whatever he did that night, has had a profound effect on him. It begins a cycle of chaos that is not easily understood, unless, of course, he had something to do with the crime. By the same measure, the shadow of heartache and turmoil cast into the lives of DJ's loved ones, and in particular his mother and sisters, compounded by the impotence of the investigation, is something we can understand in terms of cause and effect. But why is Michael Arana so seemingly plagued? Is he haunted? Does he have regrets? We may never know, but someone does. If he was involved, he did not act alone. He is commonly named as an accomplice to Steve Creel, along with Dalton Riley. If indeed Riley was involved, he will never stand trial for it in this life. The car accident that took his life this summer makes Dalton Riley the only potential suspect in DJ's death to have permanently escaped earthly justice.
So Heather, who others suggest was somehow involved in whatever transpired on the night of DJ's death, implicates Steve Creel, Matthew Creel, Dalton Riley, and Michael Arana. Whether her statement was met with the level of enthusiasm she expected from investigators is not known. In making these claims that implicate her cousins, Heather also mentions another crime scene, the abandoned house. Maybe that's why a couple of weeks later, for the very first time, Special Agent David Owen decides to check it out. The same day agents take a casual look at the abandoned house, they also obtained initial statements from Michael Arana, Matthew Creel, and Steve Creel. And again, the actions of one of these individuals seems most curious under the circumstances. Because while Matthew Creel, who was not at the party and is left out of most of the witness statements naming suspects, acts nonchalant in his interview and fabricates a story about a dog. His words are not at all consistent with his actions. In the aftermath of August 11, 2018, Matthew Creel put considerable energy into trying to figure out what happened at the house. Remember, it's February and the authorities are just now speaking to him for the first time following the August incident from the year before. So, it's not like he was under police pressure to do anything. His statement indicates that he observed some traffic at the abandoned house from afar, something he could do from the comfort of his home. Yet, at that time, he did not look into the situation or try to figure out exactly who was at his relative's house. He suggests that he was not concerned with it, even after hearing a gunshot that no one else reported. Yet in contradiction to the distance and unaffected attitude, after DJ's body was recovered from the tracks, Matthew Creel goes into the abandoned house repeatedly and makes notes of things that are missing or out of place. Why is he invested in trying to figure out what's going on? As the next part of the investigation evolves, a woman who Matthew Creel was dating at the time emerges as another potential witness and a rogue sleuth. More on that next time. An answer to a question sometimes brings more questions. With the certainty provided by an independent review of the autopsy that DJ's death did not occur where he was found, lying between the rails of train tracks in a remote, swampy stretch of Dorchester County, our team moved on to the next question in our mystery. How did his body arrive on the tracks, and why that location? On Wednesday, September 27, 2023, the FITSNews team made the trek down to Ridgeville, South Carolina. Joining us on the trip was Tucker Player, a civil litigation attorney based in Columbia, South Carolina. Ridgeville is a quaint town built around two major landmarks, railroad tracks and a state penitentiary. Growing up in a town which was separated by train tracks, I know firsthand that its residents know the train schedule as well. They know if they leave 5 minutes later that they will get stuck by the morning train and end up 20 minutes late for work. They know that when a train lumbers through town, there's a span of time, usually a few hours, before the next train. We met DJ's parents at a gas station right beside the tracks and followed them over the tracks to the house where DJ spent the last evening of his life with friends, the location of the party. I noted immediately the importance of seeing the locations in person rather than just speculating based on a map. The 1.3-mile stretch between the party location and the track crossing DJ supposedly walked when he left the party was much further than I imagined, and with very little lighting. We followed Lisa and Eric Melendez to the abandoned house for a drive-by for a point of reference before proceeding to the tracks. Approaching our destination, we stopped first at the intersection nearest to the prison, a wide open intersection with very little foliage. Then we drove around the prison to the next nearest intersection. This one's more remote with side roads and drives on either side. In order to access the tracks, we dug through a hole in the tree line and walked towards the tracks where a steep incline of loose gravel awaited us. Climbing it was not easy. Climbing it with a body would have been impossible. We walked up to the point where DJ was found, and along the way I noted how difficult it was walking on the tracks. The rails weren't spaced for easy stepping, and I could feel the loose gravel under the soles of my hiking boots. No one would have walked along these tracks without shoes. No one would have even thought of laying on the tracks to take a rest. In addition to the daunting absence of light, a steep incline on each side of the railroad tracks led down to a swampy portion of woods. It struck me that it would have been utterly impossible for a train to come up on DJ and surprise him. If a train struck him on the side, causing his internal injuries, it would have thrown him into the woods. If he was hit where he was standing, there would have been catastrophic damage to his body. And if he were hit laying down, there would have been much more damage than there was. In the place where we accessed the tracks, it would have been nearly impossible for anyone to bring his body onto the tracks. But just a half a mile up the road, the tracks were far less elevated, and if someone had an ATV or truck, knew the area, knew a train had just passed through, and they had a little time, there were possibilities there. and the scene began to make much more sense. So, welcome back, Dylan. Thank you for joining me. I wanted to get your perspective because, thankfully you joined me on our field trip to the tracks last week. And, I've been immersed in this story and in Eric's investigation and Sled's investigation for 6 months, and you're fairly new to it. So I think it's important for me to get your perspective as somebody who isn't quite so, emotionally attached to it.
I haven't drawn as many conclusions yet.
Right. And, we're all trying to stay completely, unbiased in telling this story. But, the deeper we get into it, for me personally, I feel like I'm not seeing how the accidental death conclusion that basically was settled on by the coroner and by investigators makes sense. So so the first thing I noticed when we got out there was just how far the drive was from the train tracks to the house where DJ was allegedly last seen, where he walked away from. When I looked at it on Google Maps, it's 1.3 miles from that house to the tracks, and then another good 2-3 miles to where he was found dead. So that was one of the things that struck me initially as we were driving. Did you note the same?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we're both kind of dealing with this Google Maps or aerial imagery where you can look and see 1.3 miles on a Google map, but also it still looks pretty zoomed in. So you're thinking, okay, this is something that could be walked, say, in a short period of time, but I just don't think that was the case when you're driving from point A to point B and it's 7 minutes in a car, say.
And the other thing that struck me just seeing it in person was, Ridgeville's a quaint little town, but there is very little street lighting, and it was a new moon that night, so there would not have been a lot of moonlight. So walking that distance at night, especially the portion from the tracks to where DJ was found, would not have been easy carrying 2 bags as DJ was.
Yeah, and we don't know where he was walking that night. We don't know what the end goal was. Who knows if he had called somebody else to pick him up? We don't have the cell records to say, and nobody that was at that party in any of the interviews that we've been able to listen to have indicated. So it's kind of a mystery as to where he was going.
Right. So we did, so after we kind of drove around, we saw the abandoned house, which we'll get into in a later episode in more detail about the investigation into that location. But we went to the track. So there's 2 entrance points. There's one right next to the Lieber Ridgeville State Penitentiary, and one about, I think it was a little over 2 miles south. And that one was a little more remote. The one by Lieber was extremely open. There were not a lot of trees around it. There probably would have been more lights, just because of, you could see the prison right there. But the other side was much more remote, which made more sense to me as a potential access point. What did you think about that?
Yeah, so coming into our visit to the tracks, I had thought, okay, just based off of these autopsy photos, based off of what we heard from the medical doctor, it's highly unlikely that DJ walked onto the tracks and was killed there. So I was trying to figure out, if somebody were to have brought him already deceased to these tracks, how would they have gotten him there? And I had a couple of options in my head, like perhaps there were multiple people and they carried him. He was a pretty lightweight guy, like around 150, 160 pounds. So you definitely, with 2 people, could carry him. I kind of ruled that out unless they started directly at the crosswalk, which I can't, or the train crossing. I can't imagine carrying a dead body like 2 people carrying a passed out person, even in the dead of night. That just seems ridiculous. But one thing that I did notice, and this was one of my big goals going out there, was to assess whether it would be possible to get, say, a pickup truck or an ATV out there. I think an ATV would be no problem. And we actually were driving right around the spot where his body was found, and we just saw somebody with an ATV parked in their yard. They're vehicles that are useful in that, kind of country environment where you got to be going over all sorts of different terrain. And it's certainly not out of the question to think that somebody at that party either would have access to one, or unfortunately people that do drugs often are stealing vehicles, stealing all sorts of things. So could they have borrowed one for that task? Certainly. But also, more importantly, we know that they had access to pickup trucks. We
Right.
know that they owned pickup trucks. And one thing that I was able to pick up on is the fact that you definitely could get, like, say, a Chevy Silverado, like a full-size pickup truck. I don't know. I used to drive a Tacoma with pretty low ground clearance. I'm not sure if that would be enough, because there is, if you kind of look at the rail gauge for folks that are watching this, you got the actual rail bed, which is a certain width. And then on about 8 inches on either side of that, the gravel kind of is level with the rail bed. And then after that, it slopes down.
And it's gravel. It's loose gravel, as I found climbing up the...
Yeah, it's kind of like chunks, pretty big chunks of gravel.
Yeah.
But I think it's the kind of thing that if you had a truck that had sufficient ground clearance, you could easily drive down. That's why I say something like I'd say Silverado, but really any truck with decent level ground clearance,
Right.
I think could have gotten out there no problem. And then the question becomes, where did they get on the tracks? Well, the rail crossing that we could see from the point where DJ's body was found would be a great place to do that. And if you live in Ridgeville and you understand that, okay, once a train comes through, you got a couple hours until the next train comes through. If you hear one roll through, you probably know, all right, we're safe to go pull the truck up on the tracks, get whatever we need to out of the truck, and either drive it to the next crossing or reverse out. And I don't really have a theory as to if this was the method that they took, whether they would have reversed out or kept going straight. I think it was close enough to that crossing that it might have made sense to just reverse out, but there's definitely not anywhere where you can turn around the truck.
Definitely.
You're up there. I mean,
Right.
we were somewhere, depending on where on the tracks we were like 10 feet up, 7 feet up, with serious slopes on either side. So this is something you would have to be careful doing. It's not something that you would want to be doing on a truck. It's not something I would feel comfortable doing in my vehicle. But also, when you have a dead body on your hands and you're looking at spending the rest of your life in prison, I think that you make some serious decisions.
Right. So what we did is we drove up to the closest point that we could get to without being in the woods to the tracks compared to where DJ's body was found. And then we hiked up to the actual location where DJ's body was found. I had the crime scene all mapped out with GPS coordinates from the police report, just so we could get a sense of what that specific area was like. And it was extremely remote. There was absolutely, where we climbed up, there's absolutely no way that somebody would have accessed that pulling a body along with them.
I mean, they certainly could have, but there would have been marks on DJ from
Right.
being beaten up by all these rocks that they would have had to drag him up. There's no way that you could carry him up that elegantly.
Right. One thing I noted as we were walking is just even walking in daylight with hiking boots on, the rails are spaced. They're not spaced to be convenient for stepping. And my legs are shorter than yours, but like it was like 1.5 steps every step I had to, every step I took. It would be, and the gravel in between them was loose. Walking them in the dark would have been difficult. Walking them without shoes on would have been absolutely impossible. His feet would have been bloody, I think. And then when we got to the spot, it was so remote. I mean, it was probably the most remote part of that stretch of tracks.
Yeah, I mean, you could see the rail crossings. You would occasionally see a car zip by, whatever, a quarter mile, half mile down the road. But other than that, you're in a pretty remote location. It is important to note, though, that on one side of the tracks, there is a hunt club, which means that there are trails through those woods, kind of going back to that thought of, okay, maybe they threw him on an ATV, popped through some of these trails, and then scaled that hill on the ATV, because that's something you totally could do.
Right.
So while it is remote, it's not like this is a piece of publicly owned land that nobody's ever on. This is a piece of privately owned land that I'm not saying that any of these individuals were hunt club members, because that's just not the slice of society that they were coming from. But also, if you mess around in the woods in a certain area enough, you're going to know which gates are unlocked and where you can get in and out, and when people are going to be there to be mad that you're messing around in their woods, and when there's not going to be anybody there, such as the dead of night.
Right, right. So when we got to the location, we had the medical report review of DJ's autopsy, the crime scene, all the gruesome things and it gave us a good indication that his death was caused elsewhere. It wasn't he did not die at that location on the tracks. But we took the time to like think through every possible scenario. So if he was standing on the tracks and didn't hear the train coming, and you would look at me and you would say, okay, there's no way in hell in this location, as remote as it is, somebody doesn't hear a train barreling down the tracks with a light on. Right?
Yeah, the only way that theory is possible in my mind is that, I don't know if you know this, but when people use meth, they will often stay up for like multiple days at a time, and then when they do sleep, they are pretty much dead to the world. Like you could walk next to them, fire off a handgun, and they wouldn't wake up level of sleep, because they're just compensating for having been so firing every single cell in their body for 3 days. So in the event that he had like basically the post-meth pass out, I could actually see a train barreling towards him, super loud, shaking the ground, horn blaring, and him not waking up. But if he was awake, I don't know in what universe he would have gotten out of the way of that train.
Right. So God bless you for doing this, because I wasn't about to. But you actually laid on the track in between the rails just to get a sense of, how it felt, what the clearance was above your head. And what were your observations when you did that?
There's very little that stuck out above that rail gauge. Maybe some of my face did, which is actually corresponds with DJ's autopsy. His head is caved in, but most of my torso, and DJ and I are built similarly. We're both pretty ectomorph, kind of lanky guys. So most of our bodies was well underneath that gauge, with just a little bit of head protruding. Another thing I noted was DJ's leg was cut off in suspicious circumstances, and I was just kind of throwing my leg above the track to see, okay, is this something that would feel at all natural to do? Say you are going to take your post-meth pass out. Is that something that your body would naturally do? And I don't think that. It was just an extremely uncomfortable position to be in. I mean, imagine elevating one of your legs like half a foot above the rest of your body on a 3-inch wide piece of metal while you're trying to fall asleep. It just doesn't, it was not comfortable, and I don't think that is something that you would do. But once again, drugs do make people do things that you don't understand as somebody who's not on those drugs.
And we had a civil litigation attorney come along with us, who's been looking at this case on behalf of the Melendez family, and he does have some experience with train pedestrian litigation. And we asked him about that leg injury, just because, without getting too graphic, the leg was it was like twisted. It wasn't just cut clean off. And he said he has handled a train versus leg incident where the man lived, and he said the train literally cut his leg clean off. Like there wasn't any twisting. There was no torsion, just the speed, the impact, the physics of it all. It's not a twisting motion.
Yeah, the way he described it was a solid wall moving at you that has absolutely no give. And if you think the way that DJ's leg looked, it's kind of like if you were to take a chicken and that you've cooked and like twist it apart, how there would be different pieces of meat on different sides of the bone. Whereas if a train hits it, it's like if you took a chef's knife and just evenly went and perfectly sliced it. Those are two very different injury patterns. And that's something that, being out there on the tracks and kind of throwing my leg above the rail and thinking about, okay, where would the wheel impact this and what would happen? Became very apparent. And of course, speaking with somebody who's litigated these types of cases, who's seen these injury patterns, who's very familiar with them, this is just another piece, another brick in this wall of things that don't make sense about the official version of facts.
Right. So the one thing, I mean, very clearly being out there, we, talked to the attorney Tucker Player about this as well, and he said, when a person is standing and is hit head on by a train, their injuries are catastrophic. So it absolutely, that does not track. Then I was thinking, the injuries were on the right side of his body. What if perhaps he was standing to the side and the train hit him? But if that were to happen, the way that the slopes were near the tracks, it would have thrown him into the woods. It would not have thrown him between the rails. So, I felt like we looked at every possible outcome, every possible indication that to rule out that maybe he did die in that location. And I just couldn't get there personally. I don't think you could either. So really it came down to where, we had to look at how could they have gotten his body on the tracks, and absolutely an ATV or a truck were the two options that I think all agreed that how they could have gotten him there.
Yeah, and at this point, I think we're kind of to the place where, okay, we're not going to see too much more. Obviously, we have some more things to explain to our audience about the investigation that happened. But as far as for the Melendez family and for the criminal investigation moving forward, we're now at the point where we're going to need some movement either on the behalf of civil courts through the involvement of somebody like Tucker, or through the reopening of a criminal investigation.
And maybe maybe the civil court leads to the criminal investigation being reopened is kind of what I think is the hope. And we will get Tucker on here soon to talk about, his involvement in his plans and his thoughts on the case as he's reviewed it, all the same things we've reviewed from a legal perspective and what can be done. I think it's going to be a very interesting conversation because it's not something that happens often where, civil litigation is utilized to push forward a criminal investigation.
Yeah, it's one of these things where you'll often see in civil litigation that evidence of criminal behavior is uncovered, and that's something that prosecutors use because, okay, this is now sworn testimony that they can bring in. But to say, okay, I think that this criminal investigation was done wrong, let me see what I can do in a civil court to bring facts into the public record, which leave law enforcement no other option but to pursue an investigation or resume an investigation. That's a very, very unique legal approach. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how this plays out.
I agree. And I think, I really think in the end, this case is going to be solved when somebody decides to finally speak up and tell the truth about what happens that night. And I do think there could possibly be forensic evidence that we find in the course of this, but I do think a lot of it's going to come down to some solid interviewing skills on the part of investigators and attorneys.
That, and I think that there's forensic meat on the bone. I think that there are unturned stones, and I think that there could be some answers, specifically in the realm of cell phone data. In the reports that we've looked at, we haven't seen that cell phone data was pulled. And, if you're at all familiar with criminal investigations in the 21st century, that's like one of the first things that you go for as far as geofencing. Where were these people's phones, all these people that were at this party? All right, let's see where you said you were, and let's see where your cell phone says you were. And were these people smart enough, if they did indeed run DJ's body out onto the tracks, to not have one of their cell phones in the car?
Especially as inconsistent as their stories were throughout the interview, the investigative process.
Right. So I think that there's plenty of potential if further steps are taken as this investigation potentially proceeds in the future to come to a conclusion, even if one of these people doesn't decide to fess up, because why the heck would you do that? You've already gotten away with murder. If you just keep your mouth shut, you're going to avoid 30 to life. But I think that there are things that investigators could do without any of these people participating in the investigation that could end up in a conviction, result in a conviction. Yeah.
Well, it's definitely going to be interesting. Thank you so much for going on that little road trip with me and Tucker. It was, and Andy Fancher went with us as well. Shout out to him.
Glad to have him on the team.
Yeah, it was, I thought it was really important to, kind of start looking at the scene in person. And I really appreciate you being willing to tag along on my road trips.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure producing this story, and I'm really looking forward to seeing where it goes in the future, because it is ongoing.
You've been listening to FITSFiles, a true crime and corruption podcast written, directed, and produced by FITSNews.com. We're the team that first broke the Murdaugh murders, crime, and corruption saga and the Cheer Incorporated sex abuse scandals wide open. I'm Will Folks, and along with producer and lead investigator Jen Wood, Special Projects Director Dylan Nolan, researcher Callie Lyons, and the rest of our team, we're bringing you this series of investigative reports. Our podcast aims to uncover layers of truth lurking beneath the surface. We offer exclusive interviews and insights, provide critical background and context, and report and reveal previously undisclosed details. If you appreciate independent journalism, I hope you'll support our work by subscribing to FITSNews.com. There you can view all of our original reporting, browse the case files, and be the first to receive breaking news on all the stories we cover. Your support makes everything we do possible. Your subscription helps us hold those in power accountable. So please, subscribe today. That's FITSNews.com. And while you're at it, please like us on the podcast platform of your choice and consider leaving a review.